The last geographical concept that I want to deal with in this particular module is that of the plants and the animals. And in particular, in terms of plants, I'm not going to go through all of them. You'll have an opportunity in your bulletin boards to come up with some other particular plant life that you find within the scripture and to have a sense of what that plant life is about. But I want to identify just a few of them for you. The first one is the concept of the forest. Now, again, you can imagine that in a place which is desert, the one thing that you don't have are the big forest-based trees. You just don't have them because you just don't have the water to be able to keep them going. So what you do have is you have the scraggly olive and the grapevine. And those are two plants that are obviously within the Tanakh. And both of them have a very similar reference to the people of Israel. Sometimes the people of Israel are called the vine, and sometimes they refer to in terms of the olive tree. The olive branch also has another implication, that of peace, and so there's a connection with peace with that as well. But both of them are not trees as we would understand them. They rather are shrubs. An olive tree is gnarled and moves around, and it's very hard to actually be able to get a nice plank out of an olive tree. And that's part of the problem with them. Well, not part of the problem, but part of the wonder of seeing them. They all gnarled and twisted and moved around. And in a sense, it's such a wonderful image to actually compare the olive tree to Israel. Because Israel also doesn't go straight. It isn't a people who are straight and careful and nice and easy to make into something else. Rather, they've got their own particular characteristic and concept of them. The same thing with the vine. The vine's not a tree at all. The vine's more of a creeper. And as such, again, it has a very different feel to it. Now, in contrast to that, we see the concept of the cedars of Lebanon. And it's interesting that often that image of the cedars of Lebanon are used as well for people who are upright, for people who are following the law, that he would be like a cedar of Lebanon. And of course, Lebanon was north of Israel. And many of those cedars were used in the making of the first temple. So a lot of the paneling, the wood beams that were used within the temple came from Lebanon, were cedars. And so again, that connection between these stout, tall timbers used in the temple is the image that's used there by the cedars of Lebanon. So forest isn't greatly around, but there's a lot of other trees and other vegetation. And if you start looking within your Tanakh, you'll see a number of these different images. And I would encourage you to go and have a look and to be aware of them, because each of them would have a connection with the people that were there. You need to imagine, why would they use that particular image? In the same way Jesus, for example, uses the image of a mustard seed. Now, why a mustard seed? Well, the thing is that it would be known to the people there. They would have known about mustard seed. In the same way he talks about scattering wheat. Again, it would be an image that they would have clear understanding of. So when you read the Tanakh, never just read the vegetation as if it's an obvious vegetation, as if it's obvious that must be there. Rather, what we need to say is, well, what was this plant like? What are the images that this plant's about? In terms of the vine, of course, was the source of grapes, and grapes, by virtue of that, was the source of wine. Now, in a society where there isn't much water available, and in fact the water that is available is often water that's come from a well, and so it would be brackish and not wonderful to drink, you can imagine that wine would be the drink of choice. And as the drink of choice, what we need to realize is that people would have had an affinity with wine. They would know wine. There was good wine, and then there was the cheap wine that they would drink because they couldn't afford anything else. And so you can see how wine comes out of that image of the vine. The vine, which is what God planted in the promised land, and now the fruit of that vine, which is the wine that comes from it. And so wine is a very, very strong symbol. A very strong symbol within these people of the drink that they would use in festivals and feasts and celebrations, and when they come together as families. Wine would be that thing that they would all connect with and would all drink. So you see how all the vegetation, all the different trees, the produce that they have, we need to be very careful that we don't just read past what they were, but rather to actually identify the symbols that each of those things are actually connecting with. The same happens with animals. In the animals, we need to understand the animals that come from that part of the world. If you come from the Pacific Islands, you wouldn't have a huge affinity with sheep. There aren't that many sheep who are in the Pacific Islands. Here in Australia, of course, we have about 10 sheep to every human. And as such, we are a bit more connected with that. But what we need to realize is that sheep were part of their framework. So were goats, so were camels. And each of them, again, were not just known as an animal in themselves, but become a representation, become a symbol of something else. They become a symbol of how they operate. And sometimes those symbols are caricatures. And of course, that's going to be the case. You know, we're going to sometimes treat sheep as if they're all stupid. Well, that's not really the case. It's a caricature. It's one aspect of sheep. But that's often what comes out in the Bible, is that the sheep are easily led, and often led astray. In the same way, the goats can be very destructive. Where I come from in South Africa, the goats are able to produce havoc in the society because they eat everything right down to the roots, and often create a huge amount of destruction in terms of natural environment. And so you can understand that, in fact, to some degree, the goats might get a bad reputation. That's why maybe they start using goats as a symbol for evil rather than sheep. In the same way, camels are the main mode of transport in desert places. And as such, the camel then takes on a whole nother role in terms of a symbol for that which would carry burdens, that which is able to go through the desert, therefore go through the evil and so on. So you see how all these images of both vegetation and of animals link together to actually give you a sense of the symbols that are there. And so when you read those things, don't just read them that this is a sheep or a goat or a camel or whatever it is, but rather realize that these images have got connections in symbol. So when Samson kills a lion with his bare hands, you need to realize that that lion is not just a real lion, it is more than a real lion. It also is a symbol of power and of might. And the fact that Samson is able to kill the lion gives you a sense of his connection with God, and that God is able to defeat that process. What we need to see then is that all the vegetation, all the animals that are mentioned, we need to get into that and say, well, what do they mean? What are the symbols connected to them? How do they connect with us and with what in fact the Tanakh is trying to teach us?